Welcome to the Demeere podcast. We talk about martial arts, self-defense, and a whole lot more. And now your host, Demeere.
Hello everybody, welcome to the show. This is episode 68, and in this episode I will talk about self-defense for young men. Now, this needs a little bit of a backstory. So about, I think 2 years ago, I did an episode called Self-Defense Tips for Young Women, and that is episode 32. So if you go to wimsblog.com/32, you will be able to find the episode there. And that one started because there was this high-profile murder of a young woman here in my country. And I was later on asked to do a self-defense seminar for teenagers and young women. And that was kind of my thoughts that I wanted to share on the podcast on that topic. And in that episode, I mentioned that I would eventually, or likely, I don't remember my exact wording, but that I would do maybe an episode on self-defense for young men. Now, as time went by, I worked on it a little bit left and right and was never really happy with what came out of it. But recently, one of my clients talked to me and had a story and asked me for some advice and some thoughts. So what happened is that one of her sons, who was a young man, I don't know all the details. She didn't share them, and that's fine. But somehow one of his friends got beat up by a bunch of guys. And the question was more or less, well, how should he deal with that? Because he's extremely angry. And he is now of the mindset, if I run into that guy or those guys, I'll want to beat them up and so on, which is all very understandable. It's completely human. And I very much understand his reaction. And having been a young man myself, I'm more than willing to follow him up to a certain point when it comes to your friends at that stage in life. They're usually very important to you. So seeing one of your friends get beat up or hearing about it can be something that drives you to become very angry and take matters into your own hands. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So before we go on, all the show notes, you will find them at wimsblog.com/68. That's today's episode, because I'm going to give you a bunch of links at the end, so that that if you share this with some young men or adolescents in your life, then they might be interested in reading those resources. And if you as a parent are looking for tips and ideas, then you might enjoy those. So I'll give those at the end of the episode and then move on to some final words. Now, what is the goal of this episode? What I'm going to do is try to cover a lot of ground so that I can give young men an idea of what the possible consequences are from engaging in violence. It's not to tell you what to do. That's not the goal. Now, that said, whenever I say that, well, it's a nuanced story and there are many factors involved, often people still want to have a direct answer. So I'll give that first, get it out of the way, and then expand upon it. So if you only listen to what I'm going to say right now, you're missing the point. This is the direct answer, but it's all the rest that follows that is actually the important stuff. So here's my answer to that young man. What should you do? Well, if you can help your friend and the situation is such that you have a realistic chance of getting both him and yourself out of there, out of him getting beat up, then I think you should consider it. However, you have to go in knowing that you are doing something extremely dangerous. There are no guarantees that you will succeed, and there will most likely be an aftermath, and not necessarily just for you. Now listen to what I just said. I said that if you can help your friend, which means that are you able to do so? Let's say that you are of a small build and relatively light, and all the guys beating up your friends are big, tall, strong guys. Is it realistic for you to consider that you are the guy most suited to help your friend? Maybe you are, maybe you're not. not going to discount willpower and just the mental aspect at all, quite on the contrary, but that is one aspect to consider. Another is, do you have a realistic chance of getting him and yourself out of there? Because the goal is not necessarily, and usually it isn't, to beat the guys who are committing the violence on your friend, but the goal is to have them stop and get out of there, get away from the dangerous situation. Not just your friend, but you too. So, depending on circumstances, that might actually be quite difficult. Do you have a realistic chance? That's for you to decide. And only then, I would say, well, if you have answers for those questions, if you considered it and you think that it's doable, well, okay, then if you're really good friends, I think it's worthwhile helping your friends when you can, especially in extreme situations. But you should go in knowing that it is not necessarily going to be a walk in the park. And violence is inherently dangerous, even if it doesn't look like it. And there are no guarantees. Nobody can say, well, just do this and that and you'll be fine. It's not how violence works. And when the fighting is over, there will be consequences. If only that you might end up having a broken nose or a black eye, and next day you have to show up at whatever place that you work, or you have to show up in school and answer a bunch of questions you might not want to answer all that much, and so on. You're going to get home, and then your parents are going to be like, what the hell just happened? So the consequences are not always necessarily just for you, and I'll explain in a little bit. So that is the short answer that I think is valid and accurate and realistic. It's also the answer that most young men want to hear. And if you only heard that, yeah, Wim said that it's okay to help my friend, so that's it. Again, you're missing the point. It's not just that. You have to be in a position to do so, and you have to have a realistic chance to succeeding, and only then consider it. And then you have to know that there are no guarantees when it comes to violence. Whatever happens, happens. And what looks like it will be fine might go south very, very quickly. So that is the basic answer. Now, we're going to explore this further now in the remainder of the episode. But before we go on, everybody, if you want to help out the show, hit the like button, share, subscribe. You can help out and get a lot of content in return if you become a member at my Patreon, patreon.com/Wim Demeere. The membership starts as low as $3 a month, and there are monthly updates with videos, bonus podcasts, a bunch of stuff. But mainly I also answer your questions, and a lot of people join my Patreon for that feature alone. So give that a thought. If you just want to do a one-time donation, that is fine too. wimsblog.com/donate. All the links are in the show notes, and it's more than welcome. It's thanks to your support that I can continue doing what I do and expand all my online ventures. So that said, moving on to a little bit more nuance now. So first things first, before we can even talk about violence and getting into a position where you need help your friend and so on, there are some basic truths that we have to look for and face. And the first one is, a fight avoided is a fight won. And prevention is easier than treatment. A fight that you can avoid is so much easier to handle than having to do the actual fighting itself. So it all starts with trying to not get into trouble, and that includes your friends. Now, when I was a teenager, one of my friends was a very aggressive drunk. So we'd go out and he'd get in trouble and then hide behind me. And then, I'd have to be the guy who was supposed to do the fighting for him, or at the very least be the deterrent for whoever he got angry. Now, that is one thing to consider. If that is what your friends do, if they get into trouble and then leave it to you to fight for them, you're hanging out with the wrong kind of friends. So it starts with that. They might be friends, but that doesn't mean that they can be guys who have some really nasty sides to them. And that is something that you can address. If your friend or one of your friends is like this, well, you can, go face to face with them and say like, hey guy, what the hell are you doing? What is this? Every time we go out, you get into trouble and then we have to fight. What's going on here? My son actually had that with one of his friends, and we talked about it because his friend was the one always getting into trouble, and they basically told him like, look, you turn into this really annoying person when you get drunk, and you create trouble for everybody when we go out. So this is not what anybody wants here. So shape up. And if your friends tell each other things that they need to hear, not just what they want to hear. You can do so in a kind manner if need be. You don't have to be all too blunt about it, but usually young men at the earlier stages in life tend to be a little bit more blunt. So that's not necessarily an issue. But the point is that you need to confront your friends, with that problem, if that's the case. So it starts with that. Now that is sometimes more difficult to do, but I think it is worth considering that if one of your friends acts like an idiot all the time and creates problems that lead to violence, that's on him. It's not necessarily your problem, or it shouldn't remain your problem if it's a recurring incident. It's always the same thing. Got to take action. Right, so moving on. Next one. I wrote an article many years ago, and it's called 8 Self-Defense Tips for Men. And the link is in the show notes, so you can check it out there. There's 8 tips. And I'm only going to give you 2 because they are the most relevant to young men. And that's tip number 5 is get over yourself. What does that mean? It means that you don't want to be the bad guy to other people. Don't go out of your way to annoy people, to harass them, to start fights, to do things that they will take offense to and so on. Don't be that guy. And we all know guys like that, especially when they're young, who are always the ones, not necessarily starting violence, but at the very least instigating trouble that potentially can lead to violence. Well, don't be that guy. And that is the easiest way to prevent a lot of problems, is if you're not the one creating those situations. So that would be the first prevention tip that I give you. The second is leave. And that's tip number 6 from the article. Read them all, but these 2 are the most relevant to you. When you see guys coming into the club or wherever you are, that you're hanging out with your friends on the street, or it doesn't matter where it is, but if you see the guys looking for trouble arriving, get out of there. Leave. If you are in a situation, let's say that you're going out, there's a party, or you're at a club or wherever it is, and you see a bunch of guys come in and they're giving people hard looks, or you've known them from before, from some other event or party that you were at, and these guys get drunk and look for trouble, well, leave. Now, a lot of young men then say, well, I shouldn't have to leave. And you're right, you shouldn't have to. But you have to understand that when you stay there and these guys will cause problems, or at the very least, it's very likely they will, well, then you're running a risk. And it's up to you to decide if staying at the party is worth the risk of getting into violence, in particular if they've targeted you before. So that's one aspect. Now the other is that if you can't or won't leave, it's upon you to keep an eye out for them. Because we have to be honest with that as well. There will be situations in which leaving will be difficult, or I don't like to say impossible, but very difficult, or will have other problems, will create other problems. Okay. Well, then keep an eye out for those guys. Stay clear of them. Understand that, the longer they stay, the higher the chance of something happening. And you don't want to be the one on the receiving end of whatever they have planned or would like to do to people. So stay out of their way. And that means keeping an eye on them. That doesn't mean being paranoid. That doesn't mean panicking. What it means is that you just, from the corner of your eye, keep track of these guys, see what's going on. And if they start moving, you move somewhere else and so on. And there are many ways to do this very discreetly so that they don't notice. And there are many ways to make sure that you are basically staying clear of them for as long as you're there. And you can still have a good time. It's just something that you have to practice a little bit. And in all honesty, you do this already. Especially for teenagers, when you're in high school, there will be, the guys causing trouble there, the bullies and what have you. And you know how to look out for them, where they usually are, and who they target, and how and why, and so on. You also know people that you'd rather not run into at school, so you know how to stay clear of them. This is just another place to do the same thing. And this has nothing to do with courage or cowardice. This is just some basic common sense, just basic avoidance. But if you can leave as soon as it starts, get out of there. Or if you know that it's going to kick off any minute now, because you saw the guys come in, you know they're having a beef with somebody who's also there, and that it's a matter of time before they see each other, or they might have arrived there with the express purpose of looking up that guy with whom they have beef. Get out of there. You know it's going to end up with trouble. Right. So these are very concrete, actionable tips that you can use. Now let's move on to a few rules of thumb, because not everything is sometimes easy to understand. So I'll put it in very plain terms. 1, don't do crime. 2, don't hang out with people who do crime. And 3, don't go to places where crime is rampant. So these are very easy to understand rules of thumb. And they should be self-explanatory. And what that means is that if you do crime, if you hang out with people who break the law constantly, if you go to places where lawlessness is basically the rule of the land, well, then you shouldn't be surprised that you run into violence. Because that's what people who don't respect the law do. They end up being violent eventually. So, and it's not just that, but it's just that the situations that are created when people don't respect the law, well, they tend to lead to violence. And you might not be involved. It might not be your fault. You might not be willing to do the same crimes as these other people, but that doesn't matter. You can still end up becoming victimized. So stay away from bad people and bad situations. That should be self-evident as well. Now, another one that is going to be a little bit less fun to hear is don't drink, don't take drugs, and leave yourself impaired like that, especially when you're in public. Now, a lot of young people, they don't like to hear that. They want to party, they want to have fun, this and that. Okay, by all means, do so. But if you take drugs, if you drink too much, what'll end up is that your normal inhibitions tend to go away. So you will more than likely go into more dangerous situations, or end up being a little bit less hesitant to do certain things than you would if you wouldn't take all that stuff. And then you can end up in trouble when somebody else takes you up on that offer. Or somebody is a lot more wasted and doped up than you are, and they're looking for trouble, and you are, too far gone to spot it in time, and all of a sudden you find yourself in a fight. Yeah, this is how it happens. Now, depending on where you are, legal drinking age is going to be whatever it is. It's slightly different for you than for in my country. So I can't talk about what age you should be. And also not going to talk about, that you can never do this or that, because teenagers and young men will do whatever they want to do. And that means not listening to any advice from adults. And that means, drinking, smoking weed and what have you, and all the other things that you might want to do. We have to be realistic about that as older people, especially as a parent. You have to be realistic about that. So, okay, well, if you do that and you do it in public, then you run a risk. And again, the whole point of this episode is that you understand that there are risks involved and that there will be consequences for that. And what these are, I will explain a little bit. Now, what I did with my kids, they're all adults now, they're both of them adults, is we did it at home. When they became teenagers, they were allowed to drink a glass of wine or champagne or something else occasionally. And bit by bit, I exposed them to experience that. And not pushing it, but also not making it a taboo that they couldn't even think about drinking or anything like that. Quite on the contrary. So more than once, I had them sip some of my best whiskey. So give it a try. Do you like it or not? And that was part of my evil plan. My evil plan was, if I can teach them that if you do want to drink some alcohol, that, drink the good stuff. There's actually really good stuff that you will actually find very nice tasting and worth drinking, as opposed to some of the horribly cheap and disgustingly bad beers and alcoholic beverages that are out there, when especially you as a student or as a young man can only afford usually. Then I might shape their taste in that direction, so they don't really feel all that, all that enthusiastic about drinking cheap beer. So as far as I know, that worked relatively well. But the other part is that if you are going to drink, do it in a situation in which there is an adult present, and you actually learn how you yourself react to drinking and taking in alcohol into your system. Not everybody reacts the same way. Some people react differently. Some people feel it right away. Some need a lot more. Depends on many factors. Also, how much did you eat and so on. So all these things play a role. So if you only discover what you will be like when you have a glass or two or more, and you discover that when you're out at a party or in public, that's a recipe for disaster. Whereas we did it at home, and they also saw me having a drink or two and eventually ending up a little bit tipsy. Never fully wasted, obviously, but just having a little bit more than normal and starting to get giddy and having a good time. So I showed them that it was perfectly possible to enjoy having a drink without going overboard. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. So that is also another prevention tip, is that if you want to drink, you want to do more stuff on that, okay, just do it at home, in the sense that where an adult is present, providing, and this is the kicker, providing your parents obviously agree with that. I know that my methods of raising my kids is not something that every parent will ascribe to, and if for the parents who are listening to this, you might be screaming at me right now for telling this to your kids. Fine, it's up to you. I can only say that this is how I did it, and it's so far turned out okay with my kids. So I can only speak of my own track record, and it worked for us. So give it a thought and see if you might be able to apply that too with your children. For the young men listening, it's something that you're going to have to learn to hold your liquor, if as the saying goes. And if you want to experiment with that wildly, I'm not going to say that you can't, because heaven knows that when I was your age, I experimented too. That's it. Those were different times. Life was very, very different back then, because I'm old now, and that was the pre-internet days. For you guys who are relatively young, you never knew what that was like. I do. So very different world. So with that in mind, if you do experiment, I would urge caution and see first how it leads, instead of just going wild when you go out and run into trouble. Now, final prevention tip, and this one is important and is very difficult to basically grasp for young men. What you need to understand is that, especially as an adolescent, your brain is still developing. And that actually keeps going, until you're in your 20s. Could be 22, 23, even longer, depending on the person. Now, one of the issues with that is that it's more difficult for you to see the difference between, for instance, fear and anger or shock. So you might be somewhere going out having fun, and you see somebody look at you or they react to you, and you might think they're angry or shocked and outraged because of what you said or did, but they might be afraid. And in the study that I read about, they said that half of the adolescents were unable to distinguish between anger or fear and so on. So they interpreted it fully, completely wrong. Half of all those tested. That's a very large percentage. Now, why is this important? When you say something to somebody or you react a certain way and what you see in their face is what you think is anger, you might get angry and a confrontation starts. But if you can't recognize that for the fear it is, well, that person who's already afraid sees you getting more aggressive in their mind, and they can then resort to violence, often preemptively, because they feel trapped and they panic. So understanding that your brain is still working on figuring all this out, and this is nobody's fault, this is just a part of becoming an adult. Understanding that this dynamic is at play, maybe take a step back before you decide that he's looking at you the wrong way. And that you should, tell him what you think about that. Right, so that was all the stuff that I wanted to say about prevention. I'm going to go on into a lot of practical advice. So, I mentioned that it's never black and white. There are always nuances when it comes to violence and what you should do in the situation that my client's son was finding himself in. There are many different aspects to this, and one of them is the legal issues, the law. Now, I'm going to cite you what I do when I teach self-defense here in Belgium, in my country, and this is a sentence that I use because it kind of covers most of the bases when it comes to legal self-defense. What is it? It is a proportional reaction to an unlawful and unavoidable attack against person or persons. Let's break that apart. So it needs to be proportional. What that means is that you cannot go nuts on somebody and basically fully destroy them if all they did was, give you a light shove that forced you to take one step back. So whatever you do in defense of yourself or others needs to be in proportion to what you perceive to be the attack. Oversimplifying things. If somebody pushes you, you can't do your, jump spinning back kick and kick him to the ground and then stomp him all over his body so that he's in the hospital for 3 months. That's not proportional. Now, it gets complicated very quickly, obviously, when you start thinking about this. But nobody expects you to be a self-defense expert and lawyer. What is expected of you is that you understand that proportional reaction is a component of legal self-defense. The next part is unlawful. So a crime, so to speak, must be committed first. It needs to be something that somebody does which is not allowed. They're attacking you, they're blocking you from leaving, could be a bunch of things, but there needs to be, so to speak, a law that is broken. And somebody just looking at you the wrong way is not unlawful. It might be annoying, but it's not necessarily unlawful. So that's one aspect. Then another point is unavoidable attack. What that means is that it needs to be A, happening right now, so that he throws a punch at you. You need to do something about that right now. Or B, it should be something that if you can walk away from it, you need to walk away. Meaning, if he says that, I'll find you next week or I'll be waiting at you tomorrow, then and there. Legally speaking, here, you can't just start punching that guy. Because you can just walk away from that. That's a threat towards the future. That's not an immediate attack. So if you can avoid it, that's critical. And the final point is it needs to be an attack against persons or a person, meaning that defending your property here is going to be a little bit tricky when it comes to self-defense, so that's not allowed. Now, in many legal systems, these aspects will more or less be present. So what I would advise you to do is look up your own legal system and see what is applicable to where you live and where you go out. because that makes a huge difference in how you will view things and what you can do. Now, this matters because as soon as you go outside of the law, in the eyes of the justice system, you also committed a crime. And that regardless of what the other guy did or who started it. This means that revenge, getting back at somebody because they beat up your friend, is by definition unlawful. You are the bad guy then. So then there's a question that you should ask, and that is the potential legal trouble worth it to you? That is a difficult question to answer, but it's one you should really consider. Now, I will get to consequences in a little bit, but let's first now get to the part that all the young men really want to hear about, and that's the fighting itself. Now, if you've been watching MMA, and MMA is nowadays kind of the standard, how usually young men and adolescents view violence, like this is how fighting, what it looks like. They're wrong, but that doesn't mean that they don't think that. It's become more of it's a very big sport now. So when people, especially young men, think about violence, that's what they picture. Well, in this section here, I'm going to talk a little bit about other things that you might not learn about as you are watching the latest UFC fight. So here's the thing. Violence starts as soon as the first attack is given, but you don't know where it stops. There are no referees. There are no rules. You're not in an octagon in a limited environment. You don't know how many people will be involved. You don't know how unarmed or uninjured you will be afterwards. And the most difficult thing to hear, death is always on the table. So as soon as the fighting starts, somebody might die. And injury, if you happen to end up injured, that they can have lasting consequences for the rest of your life. Because human bodies are both extremely strong and very fragile at the same time. And you'll only know after in which category that you fall. But then it's too late. Now, sticking to the MMA example, you can find many MMA fights in which somebody takes an inordinate amount of punishment, takes, punch after punch after punch and kick and so on, and they end up all beat up at the end of the fight and they don't go down. So that might give you the impression that, people can take a punch. And in that case, it's true. These guys take those punches and these hits and they keep going. Now, nobody talks about how bad they feel afterwards. And you can often find the pictures, but they rarely get as much attention as the fight itself. When these guys are taken to the hospital to get checked out and they can't leave right away because they need to be monitored for brain damage and concussions and so on. So that's the other part of the story, and that is that fighting tends to hurt even the people who end up on top. So that's why human bodies are very resilient and fragile at the same time. And that brings me to the other point. For each fight that you see where somebody, can go for 3 or 5 rounds just all out, taking punches, fighting back and never quitting and never getting knocked out. You can also find many fights in which somebody eats one punch in the beginning of the first round, and they go down and they're knocked out, just out cold. So that is the other end of the spectrum. So we have extreme resilience and extreme fragility all available to each human body. It could be both. You will not know what it will be when you start engaging in violence. You'll only know afterwards. There's a famous case here in my country where 2 guys are at a party, they bump into each other, and the one guy spills the beer on the other guy's shirt. Words are exchanged, and the guy offers to buy a new beer. The other guy doesn't want that, and he throws one punch. The guy takes the punch, he is knocked out, falls to the ground, cracks his skull, and he dies. The guy throwing the punch is taken to court, he is convicted, and he spends many years in jail. One punch. That was all it took. And I can show you other videos in which you see that people get beat up tremendously in some sort of street fight, or they get robbed or whatever, and they either end up relatively unscathed or they don't have too many injuries and they heal up very quickly. That also happens. The problem is you don't know. You'll only know after. Alongside with that, there are no guarantees when it comes to fighting and violence. You might throw a perfect punch and the guy, he just doesn't even budge. You hit him with a perfect hook, cross, whatever, or sucker punch, and you just nail him and he doesn't budge. He just stands there looking at you. And you could get hit by this sloppy telegraphed punch that you thought you could take, and you end up knocked out. So anything can happen as soon as it kicks off. There's no certainties when it comes to violence. No matter how much you think there might be, no matter what anybody tells you when it comes to how to fight, what techniques work and which ones doesn't, it doesn't exist. There are no guarantees. Now, another point is that if it's more than one person, well, many on one, multiple opponents, facing them is a losing proposition. Can it work? Yes, it can. But if you have to bet on somebody, then bet on the multiple opponents in a given confrontation, as opposed to the lone guy who is under attack by them. Because it's mostly in the movies that multiple opponents are just taking out one after the other. In real life, it just doesn't happen that way. Every now and then somebody escapes, but usually they don't. Now, I just did a violence analysis video on my Patreon where we saw just that. One guy picks a fight with a group, he punches one guy and then runs away, and he gets chased through the crowd. At one point, he falls to the ground. They start stomping and kicking and punching him, and by miracle, he manages to get up, run away again, and just they lose him in the crowd as he weaves in and out of the crowd and goes stand with his back against the wall outside of the middle of the mass of people, and they go past him and they don't see him anymore. That's one of the few times in which I've seen that actually happen with multiple opponents against one guy. Usually it's the other way around. The one guy goes down very, very quickly and gets stomped and beaten and just put in the hospital relatively quickly. So if you're going to face more than one opponent, good luck to you, because that is really, the odds are not in your favor at all. Now, another aspect to that is that it might not be just multiple opponents. Even if it's just one opponent, you don't know if weapons will come out. Just last week, we had 2 young men here in Belgium get stabbed. And those are the high-profile cases. It obviously happens more than that, but just young guys getting into trouble and getting stabbed. And either getting seriously injured or dying. The problem with, for instance, knives is that you usually don't see them until you're already stabbed or cut. If the guy actually knows what he's doing. If he's an idiot, he shows it to you. If he knows what he's doing, he just, goes for the weapon and uses it upon you. And it's going to be too late by the time you realize that you're actually bleeding out. Now, yes, same thing applies. Fragility and resilience are there. Some people get a bunch of horrendous wounds, even into vital organs, and survive. And other people just take what looks like one innocent attack. There's not even a lot of blood, but they bleed out on the inside. Or something critical is hit and they die anyway. Now, it doesn't have to be just knives. Somebody can pull up a chair and bash you over the head with it and so on. All that can be used against you at any time. Assuming that it will never be the case, that is naive and that's foolish. So before you go in, understand that weapons are a thing. They work, and not like in the John Wick movies, that's just not realistic. Now, one more point that I want to make about the violence, and that is that people are unpredictable. I'm going to give you 2 stories. I was talking to one of my students, and, when he was younger, he, used to run with a whole group of guys, and some of them were actually guys looking for trouble. They lived for beating up people. And he said, there's this one time that we were at a party, and, I was over there, and all of a sudden I see that there's a commotion, and I come on over and I see that, a few other guys were just beating up this one kid, and just messing him up bad and stomping him, kicking him and so on. And he drags one of the guys away and says, stop it, you're killing this guy and so on. And he pulls him back. And then as he looks, he sees one of the other guys in the group, like a calm, very nice guy, very measured and so on, who is walking over to the guy who got beat up, puts his hands on his shoulder like, are you okay? And the guy looks up, and then that supposedly nice guy just punches him as hard as he can in the face. So people are unpredictable, especially when it comes to violence. Story number 2. I used to train a teenager many, many years ago, and, he was a little bit of I wouldn't say a hellraiser, but he had a bit of a temper. And one time he tells me that he went out, and this one guy got into a fight with one of his friends, and his friend took care of it right away. And the other guy who attacked his friend was just lying there, being out of it. And the guy I was training went over and hit him as hard as he could in the stomach, because he could get a free shot in. Again, you might be that guy lying there. You had a fight with one guy, the fight's over, and then another guy comes over and beats you up some more. So in both these stories, the same thing happens. It's the bystander, or it's somebody else from the group who comes to, let's say, finish the job. The same thing goes for quote-unquote innocent bystanders. They might act, they might not. I can show you tons of videos in which bystanders do nothing, and just as much videos in which bystanders suddenly take action and they knock somebody out, specifically the guys who are already fighting, and they are not paying attention to anything around them. So when it comes to violence, you cannot know how people will react. It's never just you and the other guy or the other guys, or your group of friends and their group of friends. There's always a bunch of other people around, and they might get involved or not. You don't know. So what is the conclusion of all this? What you need to remember is that when it comes to violence, you know where it starts. You never know where it ends. So, are you willing to go all the way when the other guy takes it there? Is that worth it to you? Is it worth dying over? Is it worth getting crippled? Because all these options are on the table as soon as the first punch is thrown. So think this through and then come to your own conclusions. Now, a final point is the aftermath. Now, let's say that you see your buddy get beat up, you intervene, you do whatever you need to do to get the guys off him. Right. Now you have to get out of there safely. So you have to get out of the bar, the club, the whatever you are. Okay. Then you have to get to your vehicle if you've got wheels. If not, public transportation, you have to get there, and eventually you have to get home. Now they might be looking for you. So what's your exit plan? It's not enough to just say, well, I'll just jump in the fight and help my friend. Okay. What after? How are you going to get out of there? How are you going to get home? What's your plan? Next one, dealing with potential injuries. Do you have any first aid knowledge? What if you have to go to the hospital? And so on. So what's your plan for that? Let's say that your friend is injured. What do? Do you know what to do? And it's not as easy as it might sound, because if you do the wrong thing, you might actually injure him more. Do you know how to pick him up, when not to, and so on? Have you done a first aid course? So that's another aspect. And then one more is dealing with the aftermath. Now, it's 2021 as I record this. Assume that you are on video. There's cameras and CCTV everywhere. Everybody has a cell phone. And the first thing that happens when there is violence and people are standing there watching it, they whip out their cell phone. And next thing you know, you're all over social media and the news sites and so on. This happens constantly. So, everything you do that is recorded will be scrutinized and critiqued later. Now, it's also evidence. So that means that the police can track you and you might have to face the courts. I'm not even mentioning getting convicted for whatever you did, But just know that lawyers are expensive. We're talking tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars if it's a true self-defense case, and things go all the way. So there are the consequences that are there on the legal front, and they are very far-reaching. Now, one that people often forget is you might have just started a feud. So let's say that you intervene, you help your friend out, and you basically knock out one of the guys who was attacking your friend. He falls, he breaks, he breaks an arm, and he comes home and everybody's just really angry, and they go out looking for you. Now, you have to know that over here, depends on where you are, it might be different, but over here, if there's a police report, and they are called in for questioning, and you're as well, and the lawyers get involved, they will know your address because it's going to be in the police report. So, what if they come looking for you there? And that brings it full circle with what I wanted to say, is that you're going to have to live with yourself afterwards. Because once your anger and outrage goes away, you have to live with what you did. That's one thing. The consequences it brought upon you and other people, including your family and loved ones and other friends. So what is the conclusion of all this, everything that I said? It's a lot of information to process. Okay, well, think about it. Let it sink in. And for the young men who are listening, I would say that you have to accept that a part of being an adult or becoming one is understanding that things are rarely black or white. There are almost always nuances and factors. You might not see it first, but you will definitely see them when it's too late, when you're already in the thick of things. And there are almost always consequences to your actions or lack of taking action. So if you were listening to this podcast episode looking for easy answers, you're living on the wrong planet. Because on this planet, there are no easy answers when it comes to violence. The only thing you can do is try to learn and develop skills so that you can handle whatever situation comes your way. And that's important to understand, because no two situations will be exactly the same. And this is true in life in general, but especially when it comes to violence. And that's why learning to think on your feet, make good decisions, and know how things might go wrong, what the consequences can look like, and so on. Making good decisions and having those critical thinking skills that is much more important than knowing some, never fail, ultra mega, super duper Navy secret SEAL techniques. That's a bunch of nonsense. It's not just about the techniques themselves. It's about everything that comes with it. And then living with the consequences that you created. So that's it. That would be my advice for young men when it comes to self-defense and violence. Now, as I promised, I'm going to give you some resources. Go to the show notes. There's a link in the description of this episode. I linked to my blog, the category self-defense. So there's a really bunch of articles that I wrote in the past 20 years about self-defense. Start reading that. It's free. You can read as much as you like, and that will give you even more nuance of everything that might happen when it comes to facing violence. There's 3 books that I also would recommend. The first one is In the Name of Self-Defense by Mark McYoung. Mark's a friend of mine, and he's been writing about self-defense for twice as long as I have, so at least. So read that one, because it will give you, again, another view of all the things that I said, with a lot more very, very practical advice along the way. Now then, there's 2 books that I recommend, and these are from my favorite writing duo, and that is Lawrence Gaine and Chris Wilder. I know both guys. They're really great. I interviewed Chris recently. So check these out. And the first one is The Little Black Book of Violence, What Every Young Man Needs to Know About Fighting. Read it if you are not sure what fighting will be like or could be like. Read it. On top of that, I would add to read their other book, which is Dude, the World's Gonna Punch You in the Face. Here's how to make it hurt less, which is basically advice for young men on how to find their way in the world. read both and read Mark's book as well. And this will give you so much more information on how to handle violence than everything that I just said here, because everything that I said here is just the opening chapter of your, let's say, your education when it comes to violence and self-defense. I just covered some bases, but by far not everything has been said. So if you can do that, I think you'll make a head start, and you will have many tools available to you to know how to A, stay out of trouble, B, handle the trouble if you do find yourself in it, and C, get out of there afterwards and avoid the most negative consequences. All right, this is it, guys. So, as I said, the show notes at wimsblog.com/68. Next episode, I'm going to talk, I did talk to Toby Cowan, and Toby Cowan is a wilderness survival and urban preparedness expert. Now, here's the thing. When the pandemic started last year, I interviewed Toby, and he gave a truckload of good advice. So you can listen to it again, and that is episode 47. Listen to that one. And what Toby and I did was listen to it ourselves and then see, how does what we said then hold up now that we are at the other end of the pandemic? It's a year and a half later, and we know a lot more. And we talked for a really long time about the pandemic, self-defense, self-reliance, being prepared for troubled times, and so on, and a whole lot more. It's a massively long episode, so that is coming out in 2 weeks. There's also a bonus episode on my Patreon for that, because I had some questions from my patrons, and Toby was kind enough to answer them. And we ended up ranting a little bit at the end in that one. So you might enjoy that one. So check out the next episode when it comes out. And like I said before, help out the show, like, share, subscribe. You can get tons of content in return if you become a member at my Patreon. You can do a donation, whatever you want to do. But that helps out tremendously, and I appreciate it a lot. Okay, guys, that's it. I'm going to call it for now and talk to you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Demeere podcast. For more information, go to www.wimsblog.com.